The red dirt of the Kimberley doesn't just sit on the earth. It gets into everything. It stains the hems of your jeans, bakes into the tread of your boots, and works its way under your skin until you can't tell where the landscape ends and you begin. For 40 years, Thomas Mac McIntyre had been made of that red dirt. At 68, Mac was as weathered as the boab trees dotting the ridge of his cattle station, Nulla Downs. His hands were thick and calloused, permanently curved to hold a steering wheel, a fence strainer, or a mug of black tea. But over the last 2 years, the red dirt had started to feel heavy. The great Australian drought had rolled across the Kimberley like a slow-moving fire. Creeks that had spilled over with billabongs in Mac's youth were now bone-dry beds of cracked clay. His herd had shrunk from 3,000 head of Brahman cattle to a quiet, weary few hundred. When his wife Sarah passed away 5 years ago, she had taken the warmth of the homestead with her, leaving behind a silence so vast it made the tin roof echo at night. Mac was tired. His hip throbbed every time he stepped off the quad bike, and the bank manager in Broome, a soft-spoken young man named David, had started using words like restructuring and exit strategy. "You've given it a good run, Mac," David had said gently over the phone last Tuesday. "There's no shame in putting the block on the market. Let a big corporate group absorb it." Mac hadn't answered. He'd just hung up, walked out to the veranda, and looked out over the dry paddocks stretching toward the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a blinding, pale blue haze. Sell Nulla Downs? It was like selling a piece of his own ribs. The following morning, the mail plane buzzed low over the homestead, dropping the weekly supply bag near the cattle yards. Inside, nestled among the bills and spare tractor parts, was a letter written on thick, cream-coloured paper. It was from the Country Education Foundation, an initiative that paired rural property owners with young adults from marginalised backgrounds for 6-month agricultural mentorships. Max squinted at the paper. He didn't want a kid underfoot. He didn't have the energy to teach someone how to open a gate, let alone how to run a station that was on the verge of bankruptcy. But at the bottom of the letter was a small handwritten note from the coordinator, an old friend from his army days. "Mac, give this kid a go. His name is Leo. He's 19, grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and he's had a bloody rough start. If anyone can show him what real grit looks like, it's you. Besides, you look after him, and the program pays a modest land upkeep stipend. Might help buy a feed truck." Mac rubbed his stubbled chin. "Stipend, eh?" he muttered to the empty, dusty air. "All right, mate, but he won't last a fortnight." Leo arrived 2 weeks later on the back of the mail truck. When the boy stepped down, Mac almost laughed. Leo was skinny as a fence post, wearing pristine white sneakers, a black oversized hoodie in 40-degree heat, and a gold chain that glinted in the harsh northern sun. His skin had the pale indoor sheen of someone who lived by the light of a phone screen, and his eyes were guarded, fixed on the ground like he expected the red dirt to bite him. "You Leo?" Mac asked, standing by the dusty Toyota Land Cruiser. "Set up." The boy looked around at the infinite empty horizon, the rusted tin shed, and the endless sea of spinifex grass. He didn't say, "Hello." He just shrugged, dragged a heavy duffel bag off the truck, and mumbled, "Yeah, this is empty." "It's not empty," Mac said curtly. "You just don't know what to look for yet. Get in." The first 3 weeks were a quiet, simmering disaster. Leo didn't know how to drive a manual transmission, didn't know which end of a hammer to hold, and stared at the cattle like they were alien life forms. On his 3rd day, he dropped a socket wrench down a bore pipe. On his 5th, he forgot to latch the homestead tank valve, losing 200 litres of precious water into the thirsty earth. Mac lost his temper. "Are you thick, mate?" he roared, the sound echoing across the yard. "Water is life out here. You don't waste a single drop. If you can't pay attention, pack your bag and catch the Friday truck back to the city." Leo didn't yell back. He just flinched, his shoulders pulling up toward his ears, a look of hollow, familiar defeat settling over his young face. He turned and walked away toward the old shearer's quarters without a word. That evening, Max sat on the veranda, feeling a sharp pang of regret. He brewed a pot of tea and walked down to the quarters. Through the screen door, he saw Leo sitting on the edge of the iron bed, staring at a faded photograph in his hands. Mac knocked softly on the doorframe. "Tea?" Leo looked up, hastily shoving the photo into his pocket. "I don't drink tea." "Well, learn," Mac said, stepping inside and handing him a tin mug anyway. Mac sat on an upside-down plastic crate. "I was harsh on you today, Leo. I'm sorry. Water. It makes you jumpy out here." Leo looked into the dark liquid of the mug. "It's fine. I'm used to people telling me I'm useless." "Who told you that?" Leo shrugged, his gaze dropping. "Group homes, school, my uncle, before he got locked up. Everyone, basically. They said I'd end up in juvenile detention or on the streets by 20. The judge gave me a choice. Community service in town or this program. I thought this would be easy. Just sitting on a tractor." Mac looked at the boy. Really looked at him. Beneath the tough city front, there was just a kid who had been tossed around by a world that had no time for him. "Running a place like this isn't about being smart, Leo," Mac said softly. "It's about paying attention. The land talks to you out here. The wind tells you when the rain's coming. The cattle tell you when they're sick. You just have to learn to listen." Leo didn't answer, but he took a sip of the tea. Something shifted after that night. Mac stopped treating Leo like a temporary nuisance and started treating him like an apprentice. He took the time to show him how the engine of the 75 Land Cruiser worked, letting the boy grease the nipples and change the oil. He taught him how to read the tracks in the dirt, how to distinguish between a dingo, a feral pig, and a lost calf. To Mac's surprise, Leo was quick when he wasn't afraid of failing. His hands, once clumsy, grew sure. Within a month, he was driving the manual ute through the dry creek beds with a quiet, focused intensity. One afternoon, while they were repairing a fence line on the far northern boundary, a storm rolled in. In the Kimberley, build-up season storms are magnificent and terrifying. The sky turned the colour of a bruised plum, lightning ripping through the clouds like jagged white veins. "We need to head back," Mac yelled over the sudden whipping wind. "The gully will flash flood if it dumps." As they scrambled into the ute, Mac spotted a flash of white down in the dry creek bed. A young Brahman heifer had slipped down the steep bank and gotten her leg tangled in an old coil of rusted, barbed wire. She was thrashing wildly, panicking as the first heavy drops of rain began to pelt the dirt. "Stay in the ute, Leo," Mac shouted, throwing his door open. Mac scrambled down the bank, his bad hip screaming in pain. He reached the heifer and tried to pin her head down to calm her, but the soil was already turning to slick, red mud. The sky opened up, a torrential wall of water slamming into the earth. The dry creek bed began to fill in seconds, a brown rushing current rising around Mac's knees. Mac pulled his wire cutters from his belt, but as he leaned over, his foot slipped on the wet clay. He fell heavily, his hip twisting with a sickening pop. A sharp scream tore from his throat. He was pinned against the bank, the water rising past his waist, the heifer panicking right beside him. "Mac!" Through the sheet of rain, Mac saw Leo sliding down the bank. The boy didn't hesitate. He plunged into the rushing brown water, his white sneakers disappearing into the mire. "Get back up the bank, Leo!" Mac choked out, gasping for air as the current tugged at him. "It's too dangerous." "Shut up, old man!" Leo yelled. It was the first time the boy had ever raised his voice to Mac. Leo didn't run. He threw his weight against the heifer's shoulder using a technique Mac had shown him weeks ago to pin the animal's neck against the bank. "Give me the cutters," Leo demanded. Mac handed them over with trembling fingers. Leo leaned under the thrashing water, feeling blindly for the wire wrapped around the calf's leg. The water was at Leo's chest now, the force of the flood pulling at them both. With a roar of effort, Leo squeezed the handles of the rusty cutters. Snap. The wire gave way. The heifer, sensing freedom, scrambled frantically up the bank to safety. Leo turned immediately to Mac. He grabbed Mac under the arms, digging his boots into the collapsing mud. "Come on, Mac! Push!" Mac pushed through the blinding pain in his hip, and together, inch by grueling inch, the 19-year-old city kid hauled the old bushman up the embankment, collapsing onto the high ground just as the creek bed turned into a raging river of red water. They lay there in the pouring rain, covered in mud, breathing heavily, listening to the thunder crack overhead. Mac turned his head to look at the boy. Leo's face was smeared with red earth, his clothes ruined, his body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. But his eyes, for the first time since he'd arrived, were wide, bright, and completely alive. Mac let out a breath that turned into a ragged laugh. Not bad for a kid from Sydney. Leo looked at Mac, and then slowly a wide, triumphant grin broke across his face. I saved your butt, Mac. Yeah, Mac smiled, closing his eyes against the rain. Yeah, you did, mate. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sweet eucalyptus. Mac's hip was severely sprained, requiring a trip to the clinic in Derby. For 2 weeks, Mac was confined to the veranda with a crutch, watching from afar. He didn't need to worry. Leo stepped up. Without being asked, the boy woke at dawn every morning. He fed the horses, checked the water troughs, and drove the ute out to inspect the fence line. He carried a small pocket notebook where he meticulously wrote down fuel levels, head counts and pump repairs, presenting it to Mac every evening like a seasoned station manager. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and violet, David from the bank pulled up in his shiny white SUV.